So let me paint this picture for you. My brother and I just got off this long-running thing where we would watch X-Men the animated series, the one from like 1989 or 90 or whatever together. And the coolest thing about that show was that it was made for kids, but it actually was like kind of deep and heavy hitting on a lot of like interesting topics. It was cooler than a lot of other kids shows that we'd been exposed to at that time. And we were looking for something else cool that would be fun to watch together. And what we decided upon was a show that had gained a lot of popularity and traction during the time that we were kids, though we didn't watch it when it was naturally airing. That show was Avatar: The Last Airbender. My brother and I planned to watch this show together, but I had a job and a girlfriend, and my brother was still a kid. And he binged the entire show while I was hanging out with my girlfriend, which meant I never watched it. I missed it. Avatar: The Last Airbender ran from 2005 to 2008, which was like peak right me entering the high school years. Like lots of my friends watched this show and everybody loved it, but I never saw it. And to this day, Avatar: The Last Airbender was a show that everyone loved and lauded, and lots of fantasy that I like to read would get compared to this show. I, of course, culturally absorbed a lot of this stuff, and I did see the 2010 movie of the same title, but I myself never really developed an affinity for the show because I hadn't seen it, and I sort of felt that like once I knew generally what the vibe of the show was, I wouldn't enjoy it. And as time went by, I just got older and assumed it wasn't for me. But then it came out again on like Netflix or something a couple years ago, and everybody rewatched it and said it was really, really good and it should still be enjoyable for people watching it for the first time now. And I didn't know if I could believe them, and I never watched it. And in my Discord server, lots and lots of people encouraged me to watch the show. It became a meme that people would try to trick me into watch parties for Avatar: The Last Airbender so that I would finally get to experience this cultural touchstone that everyone seems to love but me. And if I'm being completely honest, I just didn't think I would be able to enjoy it as a new coming adult into the series. In the circles that I run in, Avatar was sort of like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, where you don't actually have to watch it to know a lot about it and to be able to get a lot of the references. And frankly, I just doubted everyone that was saying that it still holds up these days, because childhood nostalgia bombs can be dangerous in allowing us to objectively interpret things. And I was like, there's no way that it can still be enjoyable to somebody my age watching the show in 2022. Well, I went behind a lot of people's backs, and I have secretly been watching Avatar: The Last Airbender, and I finished season 1, also called book 1. And yeah, you may be wondering, this is a book channel. You can't talk about TV shows here. Well, guess what? It says book 1 in the season title, and every single episode is titled by chapter. This is a book in television format. And I'm sorry that I've been sort of yanking everyone's chain and sort of lying about the fact that I would never watch this show, because this entire last couple weeks I have been plotting to watch Avatar: The Last Airbender. And as I said before, I finished season 1 and I have a lot of thoughts. I was wrong on a lot of counts. I do think that this show is still pretty good and really interesting, but my perspective is coming at it from someone who doesn't have any nostalgia for it, though I have nostalgia for the times that it came out. And one could argue that things that are created within a certain time period hold a certain sort of feel and vibe and aura that can bring you nostalgia even if you never experienced it in the first place. I don't know if you ever heard a song that came out when you were a kid, and like maybe you didn't know that song when you were a kid, but you listen to that song and it makes you feel nostalgic because it sounds so much of its era. It's possible that Avatar is doing that to me, but I'm not sure. But I am here to set the record straight and give my thoughts on season 1 of Avatar: The Last Airbender. And before I jump into my specific actual detailed thoughts, I think it's kind of crazy that one of the largest grossing movies of all time is called Avatar. It's the Blue Alien James Cameron movie, and while that movie is technically one of the biggest moneymakers of all time, most of the time in the circles that I run in, when you talk about Avatar, the one that people care about is this kids show that came out in the late 2000s, not one of the highest grossing movies of all time. I just think it's funny that that movie is such a big moneymaker, but no one actually really cares about it all that much. But this show, people love this show. Now, as I sort of casually stated before, I had seen the movie Avatar: The Last Airbender, the M. Night Shyamalan joint, and so I sort of have seen a lot of the story elements from this before, but people that are fans of the show and not the movie, which is pretty much every single person I've ever talked to, will tell you that the movie is awful and not a great representation of the show. And that seems to be true in a lot of ways. Like, the show does a lot of really cool things that the movie just kind of wet farts on. But I don't want to get too detailed into my thoughts about the movie. I actually think I'll make a separate video for that now that I've actually watched the first season of this show that the movie was supposedly based on. Let's talk about my thoughts on season 1 of Avatar, and I will be spoiling the season 1. That's all I really know that much about, so I'm just gonna give my raw thoughts naked, unafraid. Now, some context for people that aren't familiar with this channel, if you happen to be watching this video, I typically review adult epic fantasy, though I read YA epic fantasy as well. I read some science fiction, I read some other stuff, but like most of my thoughts are going to be coming from the adult epic fantasy realm. The way that I would classify this show, and of course it was a kid's show created for kids, but if we're watching it in the cultural context that I come from, this show is something that I'd probably call the opposite of grimdark. Sometimes that term is referred to as like noble bright, and that yes, it is a kid's show, and so things are going to end up with a lot of happy endings. There's not a lot of death on screen, even though we're in the midst of a war. And the characters are, generally speaking, going to be like heroic people you want to root for and like role models. And yes, they do sometimes make mistakes, but this show is not going to have any of the darker elements. Sometimes that's refreshing. Sometimes I feel like they didn't do the subject matter they're dealing with like enough respect or like time. And that's a thing that's going to be consistent with some of my frustrations with that series, which is every single episode of the show is like 22 minutes long, which is like the standard cartoon runtime for a half-hour kid show. And there's a lot of really cool things brought up that I wish had had time to be fleshed out more. I will say that the way that this show is based, of course it's episodic because it's a TV show, is we spend a lot of time jumping from town to town as the characters are making their way to the North Pole, and that gives us a lot of exposure to different cities and cultures throughout the world that exists in whatever this place is called. And that's super cool. It does feel like a world with lots of different subcultures and different traditions and different ways of life and like rules of society. And I like that we get to see so many of those because we deal with like villain of the week scenarios. That is really cool, and it makes the world feel so much richer because we see so much of it in the course of this first season at least. We get to see multiple instances of the same elemental bending tribe as well as like all of the different elemental bending tribes except for airbending, but we get to see a little bit of that through Aang. And compared to a lot of books that I read, that creates a richness that is unmatched in a lot of ways, because a lot of times when you're reading a book, you either have to get those different perspectives from different point of views, or you try to do the thing that this show is doing, where you're jumping from different cultures and it makes the book feel episodic. But since this is already an episodic TV show, we jump in, learn about a scenario, jump out, jump into a new situation the next day. It works better for a TV show than it does a book, and that creates a richness to the world, a diversity to the world that we don't always get to see in the books that I typically read, and that's really cool. The downside of that, which I passed over before, is there were a lot of really cool and complex scenarios, some moral, some cultural, that we get hinted at, but we don't get to see fully fleshed out because we only spend 20 minutes in each of these groups. And because of the television show format, the half-hour television show children's format that we get to, I really wish we could have like really dug into more of these scenarios. If I had to pick and choose, I would say see less of these scenarios with more depth in each of them, but like it's the TV show format. I have the same problem even when I'm watching a lot of adult TV shows which have like 40 some minute runtimes, where I'm like, dang it, you just teased something really cool and you only got to play around with it for 40 some minutes before you had to move on to the next thing for the next episode. I wish instead of shotgunning over so much of the different types of things that are available in the world, we had actually taken a shovel and dug into some of the specific pieces. But considering the target market and the fact that this was a show that was getting shown on TV and kids may not see every single episode, and it's supposed to hold a kid's attention, and we're setting the themes for kids and not for adults, it's hard to complain about, but it was a frustration of mine. And as a Noble Bright show with this form in mind, every single scenario felt like a Witcher side quest, but like the light version of it, where you jump into a scenario, it seems seems really obvious that who is right and who is wrong in an argument. But actually, if you just listen to people and you start to figure out the scenario, it's almost a complete 180 from what you initially would have thought when you run into the city. So if you wanted to guess what was going to happen, you run into the city, assume the guys that seem bad at the beginning are good, and the good guys that seem good at the beginning are bad. Just flip your expectations on its head and you're going to know the plot of the episode. Yes, it is a children's show, but it is formulaic and it does feel like a weird reverse Witcher side quest simulator. Since this is a show aimed at younger audiences, that is a potentially cool thing for them to get used to, though, because I think what it does is it creates a sense in the mind of a young viewer to say, hey, when major things are happening, everything is more complicated than it seems, and it's important to listen to the people that are having a dispute to be able to actually understand what's going on. And maybe there are pieces on both sides of this argument that are valid, though one person may be doing something more wrong than the other one, and you have to figure it out. Yes, in the show, it's very cut and dry pretty much all of the time. There is a dark side and a light side to pretty much all of the elements of these stories, but the idea is that the conflict itself may be more of a problem than where each of these people is coming from. It's a really, really cool thing to try to teach children more empathetic things, and that maybe life is more complicated than you initially thought. I like the element as something that kids would get exposed to in a fantasy series early on. We're also in a scenario where even when people make grave mistakes, almost never do people actually die for what would essentially be a mortal mistake. And so, like, this is like a comfort food. It's probably why so many people can enjoy the show casually, because this is a comforting show more than something that's going to make you feel gross or sick at the end of it. Once again, it's the format, it's the target audience. I'm not the type of guy that thinks everything should be grimdark, but this leans very heavily on the opposite side of the spectrum. The other thing about the show, that if you just are laser focused on what's going on in the episodes and you don't think about it from a broader context, it sometimes helps, but it sometimes doesn't. And this is a show with a very soft magic system that seems to fluctuate quite a bit. And if you're not familiar with this concept, a hard magic system is one where the magic has very specific rules and power levels and ways to use or abuse those rules to be able to accomplish your goals, where sometimes the magic ends up feeling more scientific and less magical. This show is the opposite of that, where the rules on the magic are very light, and we know that there's the 4 different elements, but we seem to get them mixed and matched, and different powers that are available to different benders at different times. Like, it seems to shift. Sometimes Aang does something super crazy in one episode, and the next episode he doesn't seem to be able to solve a simple problem that he should have been able to solve previously with the amount of magic and ability that he showed. And that can be frustrating, and I don't know if that's like a writer thing or an animator thing, where the writer writes that a scene goes one way and the animator decides to animate it a certain way, but in the next show where you have a writer write the different scenario and the animator has already showed the character be able to get out of the scenario visually, but like story-wise he's not supposed to be able to, it feels like the magic is beholden to the plot, and it makes it feel more like a plot device. And speaking of plot devices, the main character Aang, who we know is going to be the avatar, the person who conquers all 4 elements, he is like a combination of a Mary Sue, because he essentially makes no mistakes at almost any point. Like, he has the mistake that establishes his character that he ran away from his responsibility, but you can forgive it because the kid was 12 and he didn't know very much. He didn't realize that what he was doing was going to end up in the world getting essentially destroyed for 100 years. So it's very easy to forgive him for that. But every time he comes across a challenge in the show, almost exclusively, there's only one episode where he's like the person that makes the mistake that causes the sitcom style episode for the show, at least in season 1. And that's the one where he decides to hide the map that leads to Sokka and Katara's dad. But like, with the exception of that one piece and maybe small other elements, he essentially always does the right thing at every point. He always makes the right choice, which makes him a good role model, a good thing for kids to aspire to. But also, even when he makes the wrong choice or they end up in a scenario where something cannot be fixed, he oftentimes will gain avatar abilities seemingly out of nowhere that just give him the power to solve the problem in a way that we've never seen before. It's like a combination of like the worst way to use soft magic and the Deus Ex Machina trope, which is described on TV tropes as a Deus Ex Machina is when some new event, character, ability, or object solves a seemingly unsolvable problem in a sudden or unexpected way. Like, that's literally what Aang does in multiple instances throughout the series. He pulls out some new trick out of his butt that he didn't know he could do, we didn't know he could do, and it just fixes the problem that they're in. And then, of course, later on, he won't be able to replicate the same trick. Some of that is explained because of the fact that, like, he is a reincarnated version of this all-powerful being. Like, the fact that he can't do it again, I guess, bothers me less than the fact that he could do it in the first place out of nowhere so many times throughout the series. So everything related to the Avatar power set, the fact that Aang is able to learn all of the bending abilities extremely quickly at different points in the show, and even the way the spirit world works in the show seems to be extremely loose with the way that the rules work. I already sort of mentioned that the spirit world is all over the place with what seems possible and what seems the point and how you even traverse in the spirit world. Like, a lot of that is so random and like plot convenient that it can be frustrating if you're trying to analyze it from a further back level. Speaking of things that sort of come out of nowhere, the fact that Katara can heal herself with water abilities, and then she's like, well, I've kind of known it all along, but we don't see it until 2/3 the way into the first season. We find out there's a whole segment of waterbenders that use their power for healing. Like, I don't have a problem with that existing, but the fact that it comes out of nowhere and Katara is able to do it with no training, out of nowhere, and her explanation is, I guess I've known how to do it all along. Like, we even get a joke about it when Sokka's like, what about all the freaking times I got hurt and you never healed me? It feels a little bit corny. On the semi-corny side of things, this is a show developed for kids that's very much supposed to feel like shonen manga. There's a lot of silly humor in the show that can sometimes be really funny, but like, especially early on in the show, like the first encounter that they have with Prince Zuko, they literally have like a comedic effect in the middle of what's supposed to be a pretty cool, intense fight. And I'm glad they did not stick with that, because that would have made the show really hard for me to watch. The battles are taken seriously most of the time the rest of the show. Speaking of the battles, I'll get to those later because they are dope. The characters in this show are so much fun to follow. From our cast of main characters all the way down to like the side characters that only show up for one episode because they're part of the City of the Week plan. I love to love and follow the characters of the show. Now, they're interesting. I feel like they show nuance over time, and because they are such good characters, both like from a moral stance and also from a written stance, you want to love them, you want to root for them, and you want to find out where their quests are taking them throughout the world. You like to see the Team Avatar people be loyal to Aang. You like to see Aang learn to grow since he's so young. He's like young enough that a lot of people watching this show are still older than him. Prince Zuko and Uncle Iroh are really good antagonists in this show because you actually want to root for them. But then looming in the background, you have Fire Lord Ozai, whose face you don't even get to see in the show. You get hinted that his sister's going to be the villain for the next season because the main commander or whatever, like the actual bad guy for this show, who seems to get his comeuppance by Aang, but like Aang seems to have left, whatever. Anyway, that dude dies. He's a great villain for the show and you want to see him get his comeuppance. But the way that the characters are developed over the course of the show is like this implication that there's a lot of time passing in between episodes. Not a lot of time. There is time passing between the episodes. Sometimes they'll be traveling, and between episodes they'll have traveled for 3 days, or sometimes they'll have been sitting at a location and seemingly trained for a couple weeks. Because of that, it seems like there are huge jumps in character development that sometimes we don't even get to fully experience, even though we're spending so much time with the characters over such a long period of time. It seems like characters are jumping all over the place, and they do something that I oftentimes find in television shows, especially television shows written for children, but this happens in adult television as well, which is when you sort of, and let's see if I can explain this properly, you write to the trope of a character to make you think that things happened, like you're sort of telling by showing, but not showing, if that makes any sense. Like some of the romantic subplots that exist, for instance, between Aang and Katara. You won't see anything about it for like 10 episodes, and then they'll throw it in there as if it's like a main core piece of the plot. Now, if you're aiming this at children who might also be really interested in romance, it may be something that's constantly in the back of their head anyway. But when it finally does hit for an episode, it feels like it really just hits for convenience sake of the plot. And like, yes, it makes sense that if you're traveling together with someone over the course of months, you might eventually have that conflict come to attention, and that tension, when it explodes, will result in the theme of an episode, which is like conflict resolution between two people. But most of the time, we don't actually see that conflict build up. We just sort of have it implied that it built up, and then it blew up. We have it implied that Katara is working on her waterbending. At the beginning of the show, she's not very good at waterbending. By the end of the show, she's literally considered a waterbender master who Aang is told to have be her master. Like, she's supposed to be so good that she can teach him how to be a master waterbender. And we oftentimes see her practicing in the background, but we don't get to see that progression take place in the foreground most of the time. We have subplots like jealousy between Katara and Aang build up when Aang is able to pick up waterbending initially really quickly, even though we didn't see that jealousy actually building up. Like, there were a lot of things that happen that feel logical in the show, but because of the show's format and nature of storytelling, we are implied a lot of things and shown the after effects of things that had to have happened off screen that would have been really interesting, I think, to explore, that would have slowed down the pace of the show, or you would have had to at least not go breakneck the whole time. And since the show is so breakneck, when Aang just wants to like chill out and hang loose for a few, it feels like he's being incredibly stupid because there's so much going wrong in the world and he seems to be able to fix the problem everywhere they go. He should not just want to go surf on fish, which as the show goes on, he does less of, but like it's a struggle between how do you tell the story that this world seems to be begging to have told? How do you develop these characters in the way that it feels like you're trying to develop them, but also keep the format of a children's television show that's limited in time and depth and attention span? And I think the show pulls it off in a way that is still really compelling. I really enjoyed the show. I watched it very quickly and I loved it a lot more than I thought I would. And my frustrations of it not being interesting to me because culturally I absorbed a lot of it, that was not true, but I still have all of these criticisms, which I think are valid, even though I can see past them to enjoy the show. They're worth mentioning, and I don't know how you solve them. Like, there's rumors that there's going to be more Avatar content, like maybe a live action Avatar, maybe just spin-offs and such. But if you're still going to target it at children and be limited by these constraints, you're going to have to find ways to answer these problems if you want to appeal to fans of the original Avatar as they are older and they've learned more nuanced storytelling mechanics. Now, I've expressed a lot of frustrations with the show, but like I said, I really did enjoy it. I really do like rooting for Aang. I like that he's the guy, he's like Captain America in the MCU, where he's always making the right choice and he's always fighting for good. And even when he's a kid and he's naive, he's learning to grow up. Like, you see that over the course of the series. I like Katara and the way that she grows into her powers and the way that she's compassionate and the way that even though she struggles and has these like moments of character flaws, like she grows through them. Sokka gets the short end of the stick in almost every single episode, where even though he's also semi-showing character growth, he's just always portrayed as being incredibly stupid, and he is really stupid a lot of the time, but while everyone else is getting more powerful, he doesn't learn all that much. Like, he learns how to fight incrementally a couple times, a little bit more by more people, but he very rarely is the person that fixes a problem when the other characters get to have that happen. And then by the time he's finally given a romance subplot and he's one of the older characters, his girlfriend dies and turns into a fish and the moon at the same time. Zuko and Iroh are awesome. We have Zuko, this abused kid who wants to be able to earn respect and be able to take care of his nation, but he also shows sympathy in a way that a lot of the very stereotypically just evil Fire Nation, like the Lord of the Fire Nation is just like generic mustache twirling evil the way he's been portrayed so far. But we see that Zuko actually seems to have a heart, even though he's still fighting for his father's approval. That's a really cool story element. His uncle Iroh is super awesome and super powerful, but keeps that power veiled most of the time. But when he does let it up, we know that he's way cooler than he's letting on, and I want to see more of that in the series. I like the idea that Aang remembers some things that are still relevant in the world. Like in the episode with Omashu, where we find out that he was Aang's friend as a child. That was a really cool like piece of world building. That was a fun way to explore different creatures in the world and different kingdoms in the world, while also having a really great connection for Aang. And honestly, a lot of the side characters are just super cool, even if they only stick around for one episode. But I like the hints that we see from like Avatar Roku. I like Jet in the episode that he's in. Like, do we get to see Jet have a redemption arc? Because obviously he has good intentions, but he went too far. June is an awesome character. The pirates are awesome characters. I want to know more about Sokka and Katara's dad. The episode with Zhang Zhang was really cool, but exemplifies a lot of the problems that I have with the series. Aang has this scenario where he's always been shown to be relatively like cool-mannered about stuff, but when he learns firebending, he goes crazy over power, which is something he's never really cared about in a negative way before. He ends up burning Katara, where she develops her instant healing powers. And so the consequences Aang should have had to suffer for learning the lesson of being power hungry, which he hadn't shown before. But like those sort of get thrown out of the window because Katara is able to heal those wounds and Aang doesn't have to suffer that. And yeah, it's a kid's show, but it's like Brady Bunch. Everything will turn out right in the end. You're gonna make it after all. And yeah, I know that's not the Brady Bunch, but screw you. But I loved the character work so much in general that I wish we had spent more time living in those moments. But how do you do that in the format that you're in? It could be difficult. I think the Cradle series by Will White is a great example of how you balance some of this stuff a little bit better. But those are books and they spend more time in each of the scenarios. And yes, they jump between a lot of scenarios because there's 10 books so far, but those books are longer than these episodes and there's 20 episodes just in the first season. You know what I'm saying? And real quick, I do want to mention that the spirit world is just confusing as all get out, and everything having to do with like spirits in the spirit world and their motivations is kind of just clumsily handled. Like the episode when they're in that city and the panda bear is manifesting as a spirit monster and he's attacking people because he's mad that the forest got destroyed, even though it's probably been destroyed for 100 years and it seems to be happened only recently because of the solar eclipse or whatever that's called. Anyway, like the bear can transform into this weird monster. He's attacking people. Aang shows him an acorn, which gives him hope that the forest will regrow, and he leaves the town alone. But like that's not a good that's not a very good written episode. But the way that he like captures people and brings them back, and the way the spirit separates from the body and then comes back to the body, all of that is super confusing. But like the end of the season exemplifies that in maybe the worst way, where you have two of the primal forces of nature choose to come and live in the mortal realm to manifest as fish, so that they're extremely easy to kill by the enemy when he figures this out. That was not a good plot point. The plot point of being able to destroy the moon and the water powers is so cool, but the thing they try to look over, which is the fact that there is this super powerful spirit deity essentially that chooses to come to live as on Earth as a fish, that is bad. Cool ideas, really bad execution. But I feel like I'm being super negative about this show, and some of the things that I'm being negative about are just common for the medium that it's in. I totally forgot to mention this because I didn't put it in my notes, but the way that the color scheme is handled in the show is super freaking cool. Like the way that the colors will change to reflect either the element that's being highlighted in the episode, or like if you're in an earth nation, it might be really greenish, and then the fire nation will come and everything is tinted red until they are defeated, and then it turns green again, or if water heals, everything will turn blue. That's one great example. Another example might be the super cool effect at the climax of the series when the moon gets taken away and everything is black and white, except for very specific highlight colors. Like that's super cool and it's beautiful, and it's something that really can't be done in a non-visual medium. The way the colors shift when Aang becomes like the water spirit at the end, that stuff is super awesome, and it really heightens the awe of the series and the moment that's happening when they just shift the colors to reflect a specific emotion or heightened thing that's going on. I want to talk about the cool battles that I mentioned earlier. Because I haven't seen this show before, and because my only exposure to Avatar: The Last Airbender was that awful movie, that movie shows the bending as incredibly slow and incredibly weak and really stupid looking. Like it looks kind of cool what they're doing, because they're doing like Tai Chi or whatever, but the way that it's handled in combat seems incredibly impractical and a waste of time. But the way the battles work in this show is they're doing martial arts that actually looks sick. They're doing cool moves that seem practical, and the way they can like kick and flow out moves with different motions, and the way that that like manifests in the world is just awesome. The fights generally feel like they are choreographed well, like a good action scene, and the way that they use their powers to different effects and the speed at which they're able to do that while doing motions that generally reflect the element they're trying to use. It's so cool, and every time they do one of those like cool high kicks that swings down that shoots fire or wind or water or whatever, I love it every freaking time. Anytime there was a battle in the show between pretty much any character, I wanted to see see how they would use their abilities to fight each other, and how the ways the different elements would counteract each other, and the ways that they could manifest these abilities in some of the coolest like fighting moves, and the ways that the personalities of the characters who are using the moves could be manifested in their fighting styles, with like Zuko being super aggressive and Aang being like really carefree and like flowing and jumping all around the place because he's a kid who just likes to have fun. Like, these are like ways to develop characters into the fights that I think was just like expertly handled, and that was like super unexpected to me. And even though the power levels of these abilities seem inconsistent in a way that is not always the best, I like to see the characters become more powerful and be able to use their powers in different ways, including the fact that Katara is able to heal people. We find out that water also has healing properties. I always love it to see characters get more powerful over the progression of a show. And though it seems somewhat weirdly stair-stepped, I like to see the characters in general get more powerful and more mature throughout the show. Now, the show seems to have a lot of mysteries to it, some of them intentional, some of them non-intentional. I guess the most confusing one to me that maybe I just missed was, it seems like the characters should be able to learn other elements. I don't know why the Avatar is the only person who's able to learn all of the elements and be this force of balance throughout the universe. Based on the fact that the show doesn't hammer anything down, it seems like the characters should be able to learn other elemental bending if they get good. Like, Katara's good enough at water bending, it seems like she should be able to start learning air or something. Maybe that's impossible and maybe I missed that in the show, I don't know. And all of those points bring me to my final conclusive thoughts. Avatar: The Last Airbender is a super cool show that I only feel I had to address these frustrations on because it felt like it could be so much cooler if it wasn't sort of fighting against itself in the format that it's in. If I had to rate this on a star rating scale, I would give it 4 stars easily based on the first season. I like what it's doing. I like where I think that it's going. Even though I have frustrations with the execution, I really had a good time watching it, and I felt passion for it. So much passion that I decided to make a video where, even though I complained about a lot of things about it, I only did it because I wanted to. I was excited to talk about it. And most importantly, I'm the type of guy who doesn't watch a lot of television, sometimes for the frustrations that I've already expressed here. But I watched the show very quickly for me. I essentially binged this show. I never really do that. But I did it with this show because it was stinking cool and fun. And in spite of my criticisms, it having this lighthearted nature made it extremely easy to absorb. And I think it could have had more impact if it changed some things to be not quite so kiddish or whatever. I feel like it could have hit harder, but it still hit really hard. And it's a show that I really want my kids to watch now. It's a show that if I had watched it as a kid, I would probably have a lot of the same feelings that other people have for it. I probably would forgive a lot of those things because of the format and because I would be in the target demographic. That being said, this could be the type of show that changes a little bit and ages up with its audience. It could be the type of show that, as things move forward into like the Legend of Korra and the new media that's now being made for Avatar, it could be something that also ages up in a really cool and interesting way. There's a lot of backstory for the world we haven't seen yet. There's a lot of growth for these characters still to do, and I need to know. I need to keep watching, and I'm going to, and I probably will do it quickly. I'm the type of guy that's known for not finishing series, but guess what? This show is one I'm going to, as soon as I make this video, continue watching. I honestly wanted to watch more of the show today, but I wanted to make sure to get my unadulterated season 1 thoughts out before I saw season 2 so that I could keep them separated and share them with you guys on my journey throughout the show. So what did you guys think about Avatar when you first saw it? Have you seen it? Did you watch it as a kid and you're watching it now, or is this your first time viewing it as an adult? What do you think about my criticisms of the show? Were they fair? Were they accurate? What are your counter arguments for each of the elements that I brought up? And I didn't use elements there as a pun. It was not intended. Please let me know your counterpoints or your experiences with Avatar: The Last Airbender or this video in the comments down below. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to hear my thoughts on the books that I'm reading or the rest of the Avatar series, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'd love to see you again. Go out there and be excellent to each other. Until next time.
No, I never get enough. Always looking out tired, sleep. No, I never get enough. If I don't show up, I might get fired. Sleep. No, I never get enough. Always looking out tired, sleep. No, I never get enough. If I don't show up, I might get fired.